Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I joined the Prime Minister in recognising Anti-Slavery Day and recognising that the slave trade was one of the most grotesque times in the history of this planet, and we must all be resolved to drive out slavery in any form whatsoever. I hope the Prime Minister will join me in expressing sympathy, solidarity and support for the people of Somalia following the horrific terrorist atrocity in Mogadishu last weekend. Mr. Speaker, I welcome today's fall in unemployment. But, Mr. Speaker, the same figures show that real wages are lower today than they were 10 years ago. Most people in work are worse off. Does the Prime Minister really believe falling wages are a sign of a strong economy?
Prime Minister.
First of all, can I join the right honourable gentleman in expressing our concern at the terrible terrorist attack that took place in Mogadishu. As we know, it killed nearly 300 people and many hundreds were injured. And terrorism in Somalia undermines the stability of the Horn of Africa, and we will continue to work with the international community to try and bring stability to Somalia and to that part of Africa. And of course, part of that is dealing with the terrorist threat that they face there. The right honourable gentleman, I think, may actually have done a first in the House of Commons today. Because I think it is the first time, certainly since I became Prime Minister, that he's actually welcomed a fall in unemployment. It is good news that more people are in work. It is good news that the unemployment rate is at its lowest level for over 40 years. That does mean more money being taken in wages by people to their families. And he asks about the cost of living, and I'll tell him what we've done in relation to the cost of living. 30 million people have been given a tax cut that's worth £1,000 to a basic rate taxpayer every year. We have given the low paid, through the national living wage, the highest pay increase for 20 years. And for those who take the full entitlement, doubling free childcare is worth £5,000 per child per year to every family. That's what we're doing to help people with the cost of living.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Mr. Speaker, I wonder if the Prime Minister could do a first and answer a question. The question I asked her was about falling wages. And this week, Mr. Speaker, Christine, a worker in a village shop, wrote to me saying this: "I am worse off. I cannot afford to keep my car, which I struggle to buy, on the road. I need my car to attend appointments, job hunt for a better position, and take my son to activities." We don't have a luxurious lifestyle, and we don't want one. We just want to feel secure. Mr. Speaker, when millions of workers are having to rely on the benefit system just to make ends meet, isn't that a sign not of a strong economy, but of a weak economy?
Minister.
I recognise that, like Christine, there are people in this country who are finding life difficult. I have recognised that since I came into this role. But that is why it is so important that government takes steps to help people with the cost of living, with the costs that they find themselves facing week in and week out. It's why the measures that I've just listed to the right honourable gentleman in tax cuts and national living wage are important. It's why it's important, for example, we've frozen fuel duty. We've ensured that we've taken some people who are the lowest paid out of paying income tax altogether. We are going to introduce an energy price cap. This is all about helping people with... Yes. It's all about helping people with the cost of living. But you can only do that if you have a strong economy, and you only get a strong economy with a Conservative government.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Mr. Speaker, people struggling to make ends meet, private sector rental evictions up, wages down, universal credit in a shambles. Is Christine wrong, or is she just an example of what it's like living in modern Britain? Mr. Speaker, last week I asked the Prime Minister to scrap the unfair charges on the Universal Credit Helpline. Yeah. Today she's finally bowed to that pressure. But the fundamental problems of universal credit remain. Yeah. The 6-week wait, rising indebtedness, rent arrears and evictions. Will the Prime Minister now pause universal credit and fix the problems before pressing ahead with the rollout?
Prime Minister.
Yes, it is absolutely right.
To the honourable member for Brent Central before. She's an aspiring stateswoman and must conduct herself with due decorum. Calm. Again, maybe the honourable lady is another member who should take up yoga. The Prime Minister.
I suggest to honourable members opposite that they listen to the whole sentence that I was going to make. Yes, it is absolutely right that we have announced this morning that we are going to change in relation to the telephone charge that is made on people here. I said last week that we were listening to a number of proposals that have been made. We have done that. And it's also, I think it's right to have done this now because there's a lot of emphasis, a lot of publicity around universal credit at the moment. I want people to know that they can ring in, that they can get their advice and that they can do that without being worried about it. And that's exactly what we're going to do. But the right honourable gentleman talks about universal credit and talks about pausing universal credit. Why have we introduced universal credit? It's a simpler system. It's a system that encourages people to get into the workplace. It is a system that is working because more people are getting into work. And pausing universal credit won't help those people who will be helped by going to universal credit, getting into the workplace and bringing home more pay for their families.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Mr. Speaker, there is a very long list of people urging the Prime Minister to pause universal credit, including the Citizens Advice Bureau, the Trussell Trust, John Major, and, I understand, 24 of our own backbenchers. Well, they've got a chance this afternoon. They can vote to pause universal credit and show that they are representing their constituents. The public sector pay cap, Mr. Speaker, is causing real suffering and real staff shortages. Last week, the Health Secretary announced the NHS pay cap was scrapped. But when asked if the NHS is going to get extra money to fund any agreed pay rise, he replied, "That is something I can't answer right now." Well, this is right now. The Prime Minister is here right now. How about an answer right now?
Prime Minister.
As I have explained to the right honourable gentleman and the House in the past, the way in which we approach the whole question of public sector pay is through the work of the pay review bodies. They have all reported for this current year. They did that against the remit that was set by government of a blanket cap of 1% in relation to public sector pay. For the 2018-19 year, we have changed that remit. What we have done is to ensure that there is flexibility in the system for that period. But perhaps I could just explain something else to the right honourable gentleman, because I fear that for all his years in Parliament, there is one thing that he has failed to recognise. Government has no money of its own. Government gets money.
Mr. McNeill, you're becoming overexcitable again, young man. Calm yourself. No need for excessive gesticulation. It serves no useful purpose whatsoever. Let's hear the Prime Minister's reply. Prime Minister will be heard, however long it takes. Prime Minister.
Government has no money of its own. It collects money in taxes from businesses and people to pay, to spend to spend on the NHS and on the services that people need. If businesses aren't being set up, if businesses aren't growing, if people aren't in work, government doesn't have the money to spend on NHS pay, on schools and hospitals. And, of course, the only way you ensure those businesses are growing, the only way you ensure that people are in jobs, that government has the money to spend on schools and hospitals and NHS pay, is with a Conservative government.
Jeremy Corbyn!
The Prime Minister seemed to have no problem finding £1 billion in a couple of days for the DUP. She needs to make it clear. She needs to make it clear, Mr. Speaker, to the NHS workers what pay rise is being offered, when they will receive it, and what funding is being provided, and what cuts she's proposing to make elsewhere in order to deal with that. Yeah. Mr. Speaker, young people are in record levels of debt. Yes. This week, the Financial Conduct Authority warned, and I quote, of a pronounced build-up of indebtedness amongst a younger age group to fund essential living costs. Isn't this yet another sign, not of a strong economy, but of a weak economy?
Prime Minister.
This is, I have to say to the right honourable gentleman, we have heard from the OECD that the deficit that the Labour government left us was unsustainable. Since then, we have indeed found money for the people of Northern Ireland. We've also found, as I was explaining earlier, £20 billion to give a tax cut to 30 million people and £38 billion to freeze fuel duty. That's about helping ordinary working people day in and day out. And when it comes to students and young people and their fear about debt, there's one thing we know, and that is we shouldn't be racking up debts today like Labour proposed that those young people would have to pay off tomorrow.
Jeremy Corbyn!
Mr. Speaker, it's very interesting that she talks about what happened 10 years ago. Her former friend George Osborne said earlier this week, did Gordon Brown cause the subprime crisis in America? No. He went on to say, broadly speaking, the government did what was necessary in a very difficult situation. Mr. Speaker, under this Prime Minister, we have a weak economy. Yeah. UK growth is currently the worst amongst the 10 largest EU economies. We're the only major economy where wages are lower today than they were 10 years ago, even without the risks posed by this government's bungled Brexit negotiations. It's very interesting the Home Secretary is necessary to keep the two protagonists apart. Mr. Speaker, we now have weak growth, falling productivity, falling investment, falling wages. How does the Prime Minister have the nerve to come here and talk about a strong economy when the figures show the exact opposite?
Prime Minister!
I have to say to the right honourable gentleman, the OECD says about the United Kingdom, we have the most efficient, accessible healthcare system. Fiscal sustainability has improved. Important steps have been taken to improve educational outcomes. And jobs and earnings are good. That's what the OECD says about the strong economy under this Conservative government. The way to get a weak economy is to borrow £500 billion like the Labour Party is proposing. The way to get a weak economy is to ensure that you are promising spending after spending after spending, and people are going to have to pay for that. The only way you get money to put into public services, the only way we can give people tax cuts to help them with the cost of living, is to ensure we deal with the deficit, get our debts down, and deal with Labour's Great Recession, which put us into this position in the first